So, well, it's 3. We now begin with our today's webinar. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delegation and empowerment are both very useful management tools and techniques. Although both used for the same purpose of employee management, both techniques have their benefits if used effectively. They also have some differences which many of the managers have a myth about. Prepare to have few of these myths addressed by our experts today. HR Association of India welcomes you all to the 2020 Dialogue Masterclass series on the topic Delegation and Empowerment, A Leader Can't Walk Alone. To know more about HRAI and its event, I would request all our participants to kindly visit the link details posted in the chat window. Request all our participants to kindly follow the webinar guidelines mentioned in the chat window. It would be great to have all the participants' feedback. We will be running a poll before the Q&A session. Request all participants to kindly give your feedback on the session. I now take the privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, Mr. Jagmohan Banwar, CEO, The Next Milestone Technologies Private Limited. He is rated amongst the top executive coaches in Asia. He was the first master coach in the continent and has coached board members, CEOs, and CXOs from leading organizations across sectors. His experience of writing on the top business leaders and entrepreneurs around the world enables him to share insights that are invaluable for any business owner. He was also one of the first Asian speakers to be a part of the international speaking bureaus like the Worldwide Speaking Bureau. He is the best-selling author of 6 books. His repertoire includes Nadella, The Changing Face of Microsoft, HRAI, The Future of Google, Get Happy Now, Think Your Way to Millions, The Curse of Brahma. His latest book is Click, The Amazing Story of India's E-commerce Boom and Where It Is Headed. He has worked in leadership roles with the corporate sector, heading national and international roles with Standard Chartered Bank, HDFC Bank, HSBC. In 2004, after doffing his corporate avatar, he founded People First in India and Middle East. He was also the founding dean and CEO of IIFM. Currently, he is the CEO of the Next Milestone Technologies, which is an edutech company focusing on making people across the world success ready. You can also follow him on LinkedIn. The link for the same has been shared in the chat window. Without taking much time, I now welcome Mr. Jagmohan Banwar to take over the session. Over to you, Mr. Jagmohan.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I'd like to thank you, the HR Association of India, and all your partners for inviting me over for this session. I'm truly delighted to be here. And I'm looking forward to some of the questions that might come up. This topic is a little challenging, and I'll tell you why. One, because we have about an hour to discuss this. And usually I've seen that even a couple of days might be a little short for something like this. The other reason for the challenge is that, delegation and empowerment as concepts have been used so much, or rather overused in organizations, that there are different perceptions of both of these management tools which are floating around. And therefore, it's going to be challenging but exciting to try and demystify some of those, and I hope I'm able to do that. So let's see. What I will be doing, and this is for the viewers, what I will be doing is from time to time, I'll be sharing some slides with you. By and large, I'll prefer to just talk, but wherever I feel it's important to share slides, I will do that. Please hold on to your questions. Would love to address those as best as I can at the end of the session. So I'm just going to open my slide so you know what we are going to be covering, and then I will quickly exit out of that. The way I had organized this session was I thought in the first part, we could cover what are some of the obstacles to delegation and empowerment happening within organizations. And having done that, also look at why delegation and empowerment are so important from a leadership perspective. In the second part of the discussion today, I will explore the concept of both delegation and empowerment at a slightly deeper level. We'll also talk about what are the crucial differences between the two. And I think that's going to be interesting, at least I hope so, for the audience. Eventually, I'd like to look at some of the considerations while delegating and empowering. So, there are some thoughts that I should be able to leave with the viewers in terms of what could be done or not done, as the case might be. So I'm going to take 4 contexts to do this first part of the session. So with respect to empowerment and delegation, I'm going to talk about the historical context, the organizational context, individual context, as well as the cultural context. Let's start with historical context first. And I think we can dispense with the slides for the moment. Okay, so historically, if you look at it, and I'm talking about many years ago, what was happening? Information was concentrated in a few hands. So at the top of the leadership chain, you had most of the information being focused or concentrated there. And then the leaders at the top would decide how much of this information they wanted to share with people, below the line. And people below the line would then take a similar call on whom to share that information with and how much to share it. So where did the power come from for the leader? The power came from having possession of that information, which was to a large extent exclusive at a certain level. Because people at the bottom or at the center didn't have access to that information, they would therefore logically look up to their leadership to give them that vital information. So that's the first challenge that was there. Information was concentrated at the top and power came from holding that information. The second part historically was differential competence. Now, what do I mean by that? So again, historically, people at the top were the first recipients of any kind of competence development that would happen. So the thought was, if you're here, most of the budgets and most of the focus around developing competence needs to be centered here. And then by the time it would peter down to the other levels, those budgets would keep on getting constrained. Now, because people at the top, your leadership teams really, were the most competent by design, if I may say so, people who were less competent because they hadn't probably got the opportunity to build their competence would again logically look up to their leaders for any kind of inputs. And those inputs then came in the form of directional input, right? So we had a situation where both information and differential competence were concentrated in the upper echelons within the organizational hierarchy. And these people would then decide how much to share, with whom to share, when to share. Okay, so this is the historical context. Now, how has this changed for leaders today and also for the followers? So if you look at it, information has got democratized, right? So information is largely freely available. There is a lot more transparency. To the extent that some of this information might not necessarily be required from the organization and might be more generic, people have more tools at their disposal to get that information. Okay, so that's the first paradigm shift, that the information is no longer concentrated, it's democratized. Let's look at the other challenge that we spoke about, differential competence. So today, with the opening up of MOOC platforms, so think Coursera, think edX, Udemy, Udacity, those kind of platforms. Also, a lot of social learning platforms. As a resource, I'm no longer dependent on my organization or on my leadership to decide for me what courses I need to take, what are the kind of competency development that I need to do for myself. So I could very well decide where is it or which are the areas that I need to build competence on. And having decided that, I have pretty reasonably priced tools, and in a lot of cases, free tools available at my disposal to build my competence. So suddenly, the two factors which were really working in favor of leaders historically, which is information concentration and differential competence, both of these were snatched away from the leaders. So today, a leader actually has to think beyond that, and they have to look at more compelling and more innovative ways of trying to engage with their followers and to have their respect as well as their trust. Okay, so this was the historical context. We spoke about cultural context as well in the introduction. That's the other part that I think it's important to understand when we get into understanding what are the hindrances to delegation and empowerment. So look at culture. Now, people define culture in different ways. To me, culture is pretty simple. Culture is what gives you the sense of, the kind of values or norms within an organization. So, for instance, if an organization values order, right, or if it values stability, then what is going to be happening in the organization is that there'll be more focus on processes, operations, and so on. So what's going to happen? Conformance is going to become more important than innovation or creativity, because the culture is actually defining that. The culture is saying we value order, we value stability, and therefore everything is centered around that. So any experimentation goes against that culture, right? The same thing happens if you're operating in a control-centric culture. In a control-centric culture, what's happening? There is a greater likelihood that the leaders within that organization will want to gain control, and having gained that control, they would then want to keep retaining that control, right? So culture also could be a hindrance or could be an asset to delegation and empowerment happening or not happening. Now, this is where I might want to show you a fantastic model that I usually share with a lot of my clients. I think you will find a lot of value in this. So let's look at it. So if you can see the board, you'll find that there are 4 different kinds of cultures which are available to the organization, right? So on the top right-hand side, you have what we call a control-centric culture. What's happening in a control-centric culture? The overriding theme within this kind of a cultural organization is that we succeed by gaining and retaining control, okay? Now, if we are talking about gaining and keeping control, where is the leadership focus? The leadership focus, therefore, is on maintaining power. It's on being authoritarian, it's on being directive, right? So you'll see a lot more direction happening here than delegation or empowerment. And that's how the culture is actually driving this piece, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have what we call the cultivation culture. Now, cultivation is really looking at what? It's looking at nurturing employees, right? And therefore, the overriding theme is that we'd like to succeed by growing people, nurturing them, and why? In line of them being able to follow or adopting our vision. So the probability of empowerment happening in a cultivation culture is way more than the same thing happening in a control culture. In fact, in control cultures, empowerment is generally exceedingly low, whereas in a cultivation culture, you cannot be existing without empowerment really happening there, right? So the focus in a cultivation culture from a leadership perspective is of being an enabler, being a catalyst, and empowering your team members. The third kind of a cultural construct that could come up is what we call competence, which is essentially where craftsmanship is practiced. And the theme there is that you succeed by being the best in your domain, okay? Where is the leadership focus in a competence culture? It's on setting standards. It's on being a taskmaster. So again, it's a little directional, right? It's more achievement oriented. Therefore, leadership may not have the appetite to invest time in nurturing or in enabling. And therefore, in competence, while the degree of control is not as high as say, in a control culture, but neither is the level of empowerment as high as it would be in the cultivation culture. Finally, you have what we call the collaboration culture, and no prizes for guessing, where that is coming from. So in a collaboration culture, the theme is that you succeed by doing things together, collaboratively. Leadership focus, as is obvious, would be in the leader trying to build teams, right? Coaching becomes a very important part of this. So how do I coach? How do I train? How do I orient my entire team or my business to collaboratively work together in one direction? If you take a pause here and you look at it, think about this as a question. Where do you think maximum empowerment would be happening in all these 4 cultures? cultivation, and collaboration. Because in cultivation and collaboration, that is exactly where, you're either being a catalyst, you're being an enabler, or, you're coaching people to actually perform at a very different level. Least amount of empowerment would happen in a control culture, followed closely by the competence culture. So we can dispense with the slide for some time. I'm hoping this made sense. By the way, this is known as the Schneider model, a very popular model. In fact, I use this a lot, even in my agile classes, when we are talking about which cultures, are supportive of agile practices. And even there, you have the collaborative and the cultivation culture, which really work a lot in favor of agile. Let's look at, so we've done the historical context where we spoke about information and differential competence, hindering empowerment and delegation. We just spoke about how culture has an impact on delegation and empowerment. The third context is what we call the organizational context. Now, what could this be? If you look at organizations, think about it. You could have decentralized structures, you could have centralized ones. Where do you think empowerment is going to be more? Where do you think delegation is going to happen more? Obviously, in decentralized structures. So depending on the size, location, distribution of your organization across territories, the more decentralized it is, I've noticed the higher the delegation and at times the empowerment as well. The other thing from an organization's perspective, which impacts delegation or empowerment, is how is communication shared across the organization? How is the coordination? Less the coordination, less the communication, lower the delegation. The third thing would be lack of established practices. So if the procedures and methods within the organization for different tasks are not very established, delegation will not happen. What would promote empowerment, though, is the unstable, non-repetitive nature of the work. Now, this is interesting. Think about it. In your organization, if the work or the nature of the work is unstable or it's non-repetitive, are you going to be able to delegate? The less repetitive the work, the lower the chances of delegating. But the interesting thing here is, in a lot of organizations, while they may not be able to delegate in such a scenario, empowerment actually helps. And this delegation and empowerment as two very disparate management tools that leaders could use. Okay, so that's your organizational context. The final context, when it comes to hindrances to delegation and empowerment, is what is largely talked about in organizations, and that is the individual context. How does the leader, as an individual, either hinder or support delegation and empowerment? Now, most leaders crave control, and I'm sorry that sounds harsh, but the fact is that we've been conditioned to believe that as a leader, you need to be in control, right? Because typically the accountabilities on most things are there with the leadership. But the question is, why is it that leaders crave control? It starts from conditioning. So I come from Gen X. Gen X, I'm guessing, would be mid-40s to mid-50s, right? Most people from a Gen X category, or the baby boomers category, we've grown up with the conditioning that there is a leader. You need to look up to the leader. The leader knows best, and therefore a lot of what the leader says, is to be absorbed and then do it. So essentially, execute what the leader is asking you to do. Now, in that context, the leader could be directive, or the leader could be delegative, but certainly not empowering. Because empowering would mean that I am thinking on my own, taking my own decisions, have a great deal of autonomy, and I'm accountable for everything that I'm doing, right? So we have been conditioned to think in a particular way. As a leader, therefore, we behave with our followers in a certain way, and as followers, we look up to our leaders in a different way. But when you look at Gen Y or the millennials, now they're a different breed altogether. And if you look at Gen Z, which is your 25 years and below, the paradigm for them is entirely different, which means there is a lot more questioning happening. So try getting work done from a Gen Z resource without bringing them into what they're supposed to do, without getting ownership out there. And you realize what I'm saying. I mean, it's so difficult to get stuff done there. So the kind of people that you're dealing with also to a large extent impacts the kind of strategy that you would use as a leader. With Gen Z, things would be very complicated if you were not empowering them. So all the disadvantages of lack of empowerment would actually reflect there. But going back to our individual leaders, what are some of the things which keep them from giving up control? Conditioning, of course, was one of those. The other thing is insecurity, the fear that if I were to give too much authority, stuff done, whatever needs to be done. Anxiety and stress around that, and of course, lack of confidence in other people's abilities. So there could be a lot of other reasons. But all of these contribute to the individual, the leader, being hindered when it comes to delegating or empowering. So in the historical context, we've taken the cultural context, the organizational, as well as the individual context when it comes to hindrances to delegation and empowerment. Let's take a quick look at this so that it settles in. And I'm guessing there will be questions around whatever we've discussed so far. So do feel free to ask me those questions later on. So these were the four. Historical context was all about information being concentrated with a few hands. Differential competence, we saw how that could hinder empowerment and delegation. Cultural context, we spoke about control cultures versus cultivation or collaborative cultures, and how control cultures also inhibit delegation and empowerment. We spoke about the organizational and the individual context just now. That was fairly clear. Okay. We can move out of the slide share now. The second part that I wanted to discuss with you is why is delegation and empowerment so intrinsic to what a leader does? Now, on the surface, it's actually pretty self-explanatory, right? Think for a moment. If I were a leader whose entire leadership was based, or my entire leadership credibility was based around position, authority, and power, that would be a very tenuous situation. Why would it be tenuous? Because the moment you took away either power, position, or authority away from me, I would, in a sense, have nothing to offer to any of my team members. So leaders who operate only from a position of power, position, or authority tend to be perceived as tepid and ineffectual leaders, and not just by their own team members, but also by their. That kind of a perception that can be fairly damaging, not just to the leadership, but to the entire business. Okay.
Mr. Jagmohan, I believe we lost you. So I believe we lost Mr. Jagmohan. We'll have him reconnect. I believe he has rejoined us.
Yeah, he's back.
Yeah, Mr. Jagmohan.
Sorry about that, Peter.
Yeah,
I think
yes.
there might have been a power outage here. My apologies to everybody. I don't know at what point I dropped off, but I think I might have been speaking about that if a leader is not really empowering the team, on the one hand, they are not developing themselves into a strategic resource because their entire time and bandwidth is being spent on transactional items which could have been handled by the team members. But on the other hand, the team and the team members are also not developing because they're not getting an opportunity to learn more because the leader really isn't empowering them or delegating to them. At the end of the day, the leader, the individuals, the team, and the organization, all these constituents suffer, and they suffer because the leader is really not being able to devolve control beyond him or herself, right? At this stage, I'd like to quickly take you back to the slide. The idea is to share with you the core leadership deliverables, as I like to call them. And they're actually quite simple. So as a leader, what is it that I really need to do? The task is of paramount importance, getting the task done. But how do I get the task done is important, because I could do this alone or I could do this collaboratively with my team and other stakeholders. So am I just focusing on the task, or is my leadership characteristic also considering how I'm developing all the individuals within my team while getting the task done becomes the other part of my leadership? And of course, the third one is getting the task done, developing my leaders, but at the same time, ensuring that the entire team is moving towards being what we call self-directed teams or high-performing teams, right? And eventually looking at the organizational context, which is how strategically oriented am I? Therefore, what kind of strategic outlook do I bring to the organization, right? What kind of innovation am I bringing to the organization through my leadership and through my team? What kind of a culture or mini culture am I creating as part of my leadership? So these are all the core drivers that I would want to be on top of as a leader. And if, as you could see, if I am not empowering, I'll probably get the task done, but the individuals are not going to get developed. The team is not going to be self-directed. Organizational deliverables are going to falter over a period of time. And eventually, even my ability to get the task done comes down because my strategic capability is not really going up, because at this stage, quick recap, we've spoken about the hindrances to delegation and empowerment, where we spoke about those 4 contexts. We've spoken about why delegation and empowerment are important from a leadership perspective. The third piece that I want to do with you is to explore, let me shut this. The third piece that I want to do is share with you, or rather explore with you, what is delegation, what is empowerment, and go down to a slightly deeper level and see how these 2 tools engage with each other. So quick question for people over there, and you can try and give me a response in the chat. In your mind, how is delegation and empowerment different, or is it different at all? Okay, I'm waiting for some responses. So Gaurang says delegation is without giving authority. Okay. And then Meenal is saying delegation and power are different. Gaurang is now saying empowerment is with authority. Okay. Anybody else? Delegation is just assigning a task, Radha says from Hyderabad. Okay. Okay, great. So first and foremost, a lot of people at leadership levels also end up using these 2 terms interchangeably. But as we know, that may not really be the case. So delegation at a very, very simple level is when I assign a task to someone. Okay. The act of assigning a task to someone and wanting them to do it is delegation. Now, to the extent that they need to get the task done, I might even give them the authority to do that, but only to the extent that is necessary to get that task done. So I am making them responsible for that task, but the accountability for that task is still with me as the leader. I am accountable. When I am doing empowerment, what is happening is that I am giving, of course, the task to somebody, but I am not giving too many instructions around the task. So even in delegation, by the way, the leader would provide very specific instructions on what needs to be done, might also tell them how to do it, which goes against the popularly held belief of delegation. But in classical delegation, the leader would tell you what to do, would give you specific instructions, would have frequent feedback sessions with you, would review your progress as well. You would have the authority only to the limit of what you're supposed to do. In empowerment, I'm not going to get into details with you. I will use broad strokes to give you a gist of what I want you to do. With those broad strokes, I will also give you the authority to do it. You will not just have the responsibility, you will also have the accountability for getting this done. You will be taking decisions on your own and not necessarily having to consult me on that task. You are very high on autonomy as well. So whether it's decision-making, autonomy, accountability, all of those things happen in empowerment, may not happen when we are talking about delegation. So that's the primary difference there. Of course, there is a lot more, but I'm guessing there'll also be a lot of questions around that. And I'd like to kind of pick that up when we are getting into the questioning sessions. Just doing a time check. Okay, we have some more time. I think this is where we could look at how the leadership continuum looks like. This should address some of the questions which might be there in your mind. We call this the Tannenbaum-Schmidt leadership continuum. So if you look at it, as you move towards the right-hand side on the x-axis, what is happening? The leader is actually giving up more and more control. By the time you reach the 7th level, the leader has actually abdicated all control. In conjunction with this, the subordinate's area of freedom, or your team member's freedom, is actually what's happening to the subordinate's freedom. The subordinate's freedom goes up as the leader relinquishes control. Now, the question that you might want to think of, or you might want to ask me later, is if this were so simple that you can actually move to delegation and abdication, which could be taken as a surrogate for empowerment. If it were that simple to do this, why is it that we don't see leaders doing it? Why is it that we don't see team members and subordinates getting that kind of freedom to actually think for themselves, take decisions on their own? Is a question you might want to put up, and I'd be glad to answer that. But here are some leadership styles that leaders could use. Now, I might also want to tell you here at this stage that while we're talking about delegation and empowerment, it does not mean that the other leadership styles, which is telling, selling, suggestion, consulting, joining, that these are bad. These styles are good or bad depending on the situation and the kind of person that you're dealing with, right? And the kind of culture or the cultural ecosystem in which you're operating. But I thought I'll leave this continuum with you. So just in case you have questions around this, you should be able to ask me those questions later on. Okay, this takes me to the final stage, which is what are some of the considerations that I would recommend while trying to delegate or empower individuals. The first is competence. And we can actually knock this off. We don't need the slide for this, I remember it. Competence and commitment are very important when you're looking at delegating or empowering. I have seen a lot of leaders, and some of these leaders are CXOs, I have seen a lot of leaders making the mistake, unwittingly, of delegating to people who may not have the competence or commitment. So just because a person happens to be at a senior level, or because I have a certain perception of that person, could be subjective, unless I have validated that the competence and the commitment exists within that person, to delegate or empower such an individual would be potential harakiri or suicide. So one of the first things I want to do when I'm looking at delegating is to ensure that the competence and commitment has been validated. How do you validate competence? Competent is nothing but the knowledge and skills. It's easy to do that. You could do it through observation on the job. You could, you could look at giving opportunities to people, see how they respond to those opportunities, how well they do, where they're faltering. So all of those are different ways of trying to figure out competence, and likewise commitment as well. Commitment is the willingness, right, to do stuff. It also reflects your enthusiasm, your motivation, your confidence for whatever task you're supposed to do. So validating competence and commitment becomes very important while delegating or empowering. The next is trustworthiness. Look, if I'm the leader and I have to empower someone to do something, and I'm making them accountable for that, I need to be able to trust them. Now, trust is both ways. I could be a leader who may not trust somebody despite them being trustworthy, in which case I need to look inwards and ask myself, what is stopping me from, trusting the other person? But the other thing could also be true. I'm willing to trust, but what if the person is not trustworthy? So either they've not demonstrated commitment in the past, or I find they don't have the requisite competence. Then I cannot trust them to delegate to them, let alone empowering them, right? The other thing that I normally see leaders looking at in people before empowering them is, what is those people's commitment to their self-development? So how committed are those people to continuously learn and evolve from all the sources that are available to them, right? You remember we started this discussion by saying that information has got democratized. Differential competence doesn't exist because now people have platforms through which they can add to their competence. But then they have to do that. As a leader, I would want to see within my team, are people committed to their self-development? If they are, then they are potentially great candidates that I might want to look at either delegating to or empowering. The other thing that I've noticed a lot of leaders do when they look at empowerment or delegation is they look for healthy curiosity within their team members. Healthy curiosity, willingness to experiment. So healthy curiosity is the person, curious enough to ask more questions, not necessarily to me, but within himself or herself. Is the person given to introspection? Does the person talk to other stakeholders and try and figure out what's happening or what could potentially happen? That's healthy curiosity. The other part is willingness to experiment. So not just asking questions, but also having the courage to look for answers, even if it means experimenting to try and figure out some answers which may not be known to anyone, including the leader. Leaders love these kind of people. And I think it's essential that leaders consciously look for these kind of people, because unless you have those kind of people, who are you going to delegate to? Who are you going to empower, right? The other thing is, within my team, do I have paradigm shifters or do I have followers? If it's a team where everybody is just going to follow the paradigm blindly, then this team is headed for sudden death. And if there are a lot of these teams within the organization is headed towards sudden death. So as a leader, what you might want to look at is, who are the potential paradigm shifters within your business or within your team? These are the people that need nurturing. These are the people that you want to actually, set them free to be able to think for themselves, take decisions. Of course, you will do this gradually, because doing this all of a sudden is again potential suicide. So observation, validation, and then, going for that. Now, these are things that you're looking for in your team, but what is it that you're looking at as far as you as a leader are concerned? One is balancing the leadership deliverables. Remember, we spoke about getting the task done, the individual focus, team focus, and the organizational focus. So balancing all of those deliverables. Now, how are you going to do that? Coaching becomes very important. Now, one of the areas where I feel some of the leaders can really do a much more better job is in taking time out to coach their team members. Because unless you coach them, how are you going to raise their competence levels? How is their commitment level going to go up, right? And if that doesn't go up, you cannot delegate, you cannot empower. So it becomes a vicious circle in that sense. And you'll never be able to delegate. Now, a lot of leaders say that we don't have the time to spend coaching people. The question I like to pose to them is, why is it that you do not have the time? Because you do not have the time because you're doing stuff which ideally some of your team members could have done. But because they have not been coached, they cannot do that. So you are still focused on transactional items. So again, it's a vicious cycle. Okay. Self-awareness and self-regulation, I think for any leader, very critical. So I could be control-centric, but am I aware that I crave control? Because being aware that I crave control in itself is the beginning of relinquishing control. But what if I'm not even aware of that? What if I have not set up feedback processes within my organization or my team for people to come and tell me upfront, you crave control. We'd like you to relinquish some of that to us. So self-awareness, important. Even more important, self-regulation. What do I mean by that? So, okay, I have analyzed that as a personality, I crave control, but what am I doing about it? Am I able to regulate it? Am I able to manage it when it requires to be managed? If not, not only am I failing at my leadership role, I am setting the wrong precedent for my team members to follow, because a lot of them are going to fashion their own leadership styles around what they see me doing or not doing. Okay, so self-awareness and self-regulation. The other is leadership culture. Now, I understand that a lot of times as leaders, we may not have the ability to change organizational culture. That takes months, at times years, to change. So what if I'm caught in a control culture? We spoke about those four cultural constructs: control, competence, collaboration, and cultivation. So what if I'm caught up in a control culture and I say, well, in my organization, the overriding theme is success by gaining and retaining control. So how do I end up empowering people? Now, you may not have control over the organizational culture, but you certainly have control over the culture that you set within your business or your team. And that's the leadership culture that you set. So questioning ourselves, what is the leadership culture that I'm really setting within my business, could be another essential consideration in the path towards effective delegation, effective empowerment. And eventually, look, if you've found the right people, if you've empowered them, then we need to get out of the way. Get out of the way and let them do what they're empowered to do, and then hold them accountable for that. And that's really the leadership challenge. The leadership challenge is not delegation. The leadership challenge is empowerment, and after empowerment, letting them be by getting out of their way, right? And only keeping them accountable to what they were supposed to do. I think, in short, if we can do some of these things, delegation and empowerment both can be achieved well. Delegation, again, as you would have probably figured out earlier and certainly now, delegation is much easier. It's a very simple task of just attributing a task to someone. Empowerment is the real challenge. Creating a bunch of people in your team, in your company, who can think for themselves, who have the ability to do things themselves, who can be autonomous without being uncomfortable, who can speak up, and who can take up accountability, which means huge ownership. That is the leadership challenge. And if we can kind of do that, I think we're onto a good path. And as the topic said, you certainly don't need to be a leader who walks alone, because you will have a mile of followers who will be willing to do just about anything for you and the organization. And that's really what is the best outcome that any leader can expect. I was given 45 minutes to have my say. 45 minutes are over. I'm open to questions. Please feel free to throw them at me. I may not be able to answer all of them, but whatever I can, to the best of my abilities, I'd be more than happy to do so. Okay, I have a few questions which have. Peter, thank you so much. I see these questions, so it might be difficult for me to scroll up.
Yeah, so do you want me to take them for you?
No, so I'm just looking at the questions that you sent me on WhatsApp. So I'll just kind of address those.
Sure, sir.
So one question is, how can leaders develop the necessary agility within the team to ensure there is no lag and service deficiency in the team deliverables? Okay, so how do you deliver, or rather, how do you develop agility within the team? Firstly, agility requires that it is not just you on top of things. You have a whole lot of people collaborating with you to get stuff done, right? And that those people who are collaborating with you have the necessary expertise and willingness to actually get things done. So to get agility, I think the first thing is environmental awareness. As a leader, what have you done to encourage environmental awareness within your team? How freely is information flowing within your team? Because if information blockages are there, how is agility going to happen? 3, do you have empowered people within your team to take quick decisions? So I'll give you an example. There is a company called Zappos. A lot of you might have heard of it. At Zappos, a customer executive has the empowerment to spend up to $2,000 on a customer complaint, and there is no limit to how many customer complaints they can spend this money on. Now that's agility, which means this customer relation executive doesn't have to come back to the supervisor or to the supervisor's leader to ask for approval. They're empowered enough to do that. Empowerment brings agility. The other question that I have is, what leadership traits are essential, particularly for the current times when teams are working remotely? Look, I think firstly, trust. The trust and the faith that if they are out there, they're going to be working and they're not going to be, playing foosball or something else. That trust is very important. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting on their case and it's not going to be helpful to any of you. The other thing is empathy. Realizing that while people might be working, sitting at home, they may not be working in the same manner as you have been used to seeing them work. And that the change situation also requires a change style of operations, being empathetic to that and being willing to accept that new norm as something which is there. I think the third thing is because there's so many things on hand. I remember in the initial days when the pandemic started, we had distributed chores around the house, including, me doing utensils on some of the days and doing other stuff as well. Now, things need to be prioritized. So as the leader, I would expect that one of the things the leader would also do is prioritize not just their deliverables, but also help the team members prioritize theirs, right? Unless they're already highly empowered teams, in which case you don't really need to get into it because they're capable of prioritizing on their own. But trust, empathy, the ability to prioritize, and ongoing communication doesn't have to be 2 hours a day, but frequent communication so that the connectedness stays. I think those are some of the things which are really important in today's time for leaders. Okay, there is distributive leadership a way to empowerment? I wonder who has asked this question. This is a very powerful question, and not too many people actually talk about distributive leadership. For people who may not be aware of the concept of distributive leadership, this emerged more in the arena of education research, but now you have various organizations and industries actually adopting this. In short, what happens in distributed leadership is that the focus is less on the traits of a leader or on a particular situation, but the focus is more on how various tasks can be stretched or distributed across the span of the organization, right? And therefore, the leader's critical task there is to engage in tasks that are distributed across the organization. So how does the leader follower situation, all of these align? That defines the success of distributed leadership. And to your question, I think it goes a long way in helping empowerment happen, because it takes the focus away from the leader and also puts some of the onus on the followers as well. There is another very neat question. I'm actually delighted at some of these questions. What is the new concept of connected leadership? I'm wondering, have some of these questions been thrown to catch me off guard? Because these are really tough ones, but also exciting. Okay. When we are talking about connected leadership, there are 5 principles that the leader would really follow. So are you inspirational enough to your team members, right? How do you motivate people? How do you inspire people? Challenge number 1. Challenge number 2, are you authentic? Do your people see you as authentic? If they don't, then obviously that's a problem. Challenge number 3, do you share power? Challenge number 4, are you collaborative? And challenge number 5, how exploratory are you? So these are the 5 principles of connected leadership. And to your question, if you are actually following the concept of connected leadership, empowerment actually becomes easier. So if you look at all these things, inspirational, authentic, collaborative, sharing of power, exploratory, which means more conducive towards innovation and change management, all of these go a long way towards delegation and empowerment of people. Okay. Then there is a question, how do I cultivate a sense of belonging within the team so that everybody understands and realizes that one team member's failure or success is everybody's? I think that's a very straightforward question. Simple on the surface, difficult, challenging to actually achieve. Think for a moment, not from an organizational context, but from a family's context. So in a family, you have a lot of people. The mother has a say, the father has a say, right? Or depending on who is more dominant, it could be a patriarchal family or a matriarchal family. But at the end of the day, a lot of decisions get taken, which are either good for the entire family or bad for the entire family. How do families work on this? Families who are able to do this really well essentially talk openly and transparently with each of the stakeholders present. They discuss what could be the potential opportunities and the potential threats of any decision being taken. And then a lot of those decisions are taken. Sometimes the parent might actually take a decision, even if there is a lack of conformance or validation or consensus from all the stakeholders. And that's exactly what happens in leadership. If you really want to drive that culture where everybody owns the success and failure, I think decisions decision can still be taken by the leader, but what happens prior to the decision, which means debate the entire problem, understanding the entire problem, if that is managed collaboratively and you are able to give stakeholders an opportunity to speak up, share their perspective, debate the perspective even if you don't agree with it, that'll be a situation where people actually own the success as well as the failure. And I might also add that if you ask a lot of questions at that stage, if you act as a facilitator or as a coach when that is happening, that makes the process even more effective. And one more thing I've seen successful leaders do in getting people to share success and failures both is getting people to set goals for themselves. I see a lot of organizations where goal setting is actually not handed down from the top, but within businesses, people are asked to articulate their own goals, set their own goals, and come up with a plan on how they're going to achieve it. Now, when you're doing that as a team, You own the success and the failure both. And if your uh, performance measurement is also giving greater focus to what you're doing collaboratively than at an individual level, then it is even more so. If you go back to the culture model that I showed you, that's where a collaborative culture really gains over a competence culture, because in collaborative cultures, people are actually able to set goals also collaboratively and set about achieving them collaboratively as well. So that's my response to that question. You have, I hope that answers it. Okay, there are a lot more. Um, Dr. Dheer says, so cultivation is enabler for competence. Cultivation is in the short term an enabler more for empowerment, Dr. Dheer. But in the long term, what happens is where cultivation cultures have been allowed to breed for a longer time, competence becomes a logical outcome of the process. Um, so to your question, competence will follow a cultivation culture. But the focus of a cultivation culture is not necessarily competence in the short term. It's more of nurturing and allowing people to do whatever they do in line with the set vision and goals or purpose of the organization. Uh, Setu Shah says, nice take on collaboration. Thank you, Setu. Is this model 4 quadrants or a journey? And how do we foster collaboration? Setu, those are a lot of questions there. Thank you. This is a model, Setu. Now, so this is not necessarily a journey, it's a model. But so what this means is there would be a dominant culture within any organization. It could be control, cultivation, collaboration, or competence. But it doesn't mean that across the organization, that entire culture would predominate all the time. There could be certain pockets where there could be other cultural fragments also being visible. So that's one part of your question. Is this a journey? No, I wouldn't say it is a journey. I'm not even sure if it ought to be a journey, because depending on the kind of organization, the industry you're in, the life stage at which you are operating, uh, at different stages, different cultures would actually work more effectively, right? Also, depending on what it is that you want to do. So if I want to apply agile in an organization, I would work with a cultivation or collaboration culture. But if I'm doing Kanban, I would go in more for a control culture. So craftsmanship, competence culture. So it's certainly not a journey, and it's not that one culture is bad compared to the other. To a large extent, it's also defined by what is it that you want to achieve. Okay. Does empowerment hinder delegation process? This is from Preeti B. Preeti, empowerment does not hinder delegation. If you look at it, empowerment is a much more high value item. In delegation, you are just assigning a task. In empowerment, the very fact that you're empowering someone reflects the kind of resource you are working with, and this is obviously a very high order resource, so that's good. The second thing is, as a leader, you are able to give that autonomy to the person, and allow them to take decisions on their own, work independently on it, and own their results as well. So I don't see why empowerment should be detrimental to delegation at all. I think empowerment is great, does not interfere with delegation. The reverse, however, may not be true. Delegation may not necessarily lead to empowerment unless both the employee and the leader are mature enough, one to empower and the other to get empowered. Okay. Anish Mascreen has asked a question. Does the leadership continuum path run on similar lines to the situational leadership model? Anish, yes and no. So the situational leadership model from Paul Hersey and Kenneth Blanchard basically talks about 4 quadrants, where depending on the maturity level, competence and commitment level of the resource, you would apply the appropriate leadership style, which could be directive, coaching, supportive, or delegative, right? So the emphasis there is on diagnosis first, and after diagnosing on competence commitment, then applying the appropriate style. The continuum, as mentioned by Schmidt, is actually just that. It's a continuum. The situational leadership model is not a continuum. At any time, I could be looking at different resources, and I could be dealing with them very differently. In the leadership continuum from Schmidt, what he's really talking about is that there are different ways of dealing with people depending on the situation, depending on the context, and depending also, of course, on the maturity level of the person. So there are similarities, but no, it's not that they are replacements of the other. One is not a replacement of the other. Okay. Preeti has asked a question, empowering the team, making them accountable. What if the project does not go the way it had to and fails, as the leader is not accountable, but the team is? So Preeti, projects don't fail because a leader is accountable or the team is accountable. Projects fail if what was supposed to be done has not been done, right? If anything, if the team is more accountable, the chances of the team actually getting that deliverable done is more probable than if the team were not accountable at all. So no, it's not that because the leader is not accountable, the project will fail. Projects will fail either because the leader has empowered the wrong team. So they were not the right people to have been given that empowerment. That could be one area where the mismatch has happened. Because once you are empowered, the leader is actually then, not monitoring you closely. There is less frequent feedback and so on and so forth. So I think it essentially boils down to the quality of the team that you've empowered to. If that has not been thought through, that could be one of the reasons why the project might actually end up failing. Krishnan says, can we state that the empowerment would finally make me redundant and make me ready for the next role? Krishnan, great point. And by the way, that's a thought which keeps a lot of leaders from, forget empowering, even delegating, because the fear there is of becoming redundant. But I'm glad you asked this question, and I think that shows your leadership maturity, Krishnan. Truly effective leaders look at redundancy in a very positive manner. For them, redundancy is where they've set things in order at the current leadership role, and therefore they are now ready to transition to the next role. And I think, yes, empowerment does lay the foundation for that to happen. Peter, I have a lot more questions, but I can also see that we might be constrained for time. So what is your suggestion? Do I take more questions or?
Yes, sir. We can definitely go ahead. We can have those questions addressed, and we have time. Yeah.
Okay. So Chevy James says, want empowerment create insecurity in a leader, as this empowerment might nurture a new, more competent leader in the team? Chevy, I think that question might have been asked before I responded to Krishnan here. Yes, that is a concern which a lot of leaders have. But remember, you have been empowered to reach a certain level by a certain leader. And I think that's very visible to everybody within the organization, including you and the leader himself or herself. So for this particular role, you might now be an equally good resource, but it's also true that your leader would now be ready for the next transition, and that's really their journey. And effective leaders would be looking at that. Meenal Nikam has asked, my question is, how do I deal with leaders who are involved only in transactional activities getting done without empowering and training them to go one level up based on the skills? Meenal, great question. Meenal, to a certain extent, this will also depend on the kind of culture which is predominant in your organization. If it is the kind of culture where over delegation, or in other words, dumping of responsibility happens, then obviously it's a tough one. And you have two recourses. One is to manage that conflict with your leader assertively. So the skills which would help you there are assertion. The other, of course, is your influencing style. I would recommend a joint problem solving influencing style, also otherwise known as a collaborative influencing style. Um, uh, and I would recommend that. So if I were in your position, I would actually broach this with my leader. The way I would do it would be important to the outcome. I would share with my leader what I feel is happening and how I feel about what is happening. Many a times we don't share our feelings, we just share um, our thoughts, and therefore it becomes difficult for the leader also to be empathetic. I would share my feelings about what is happening. I would also share my expectations, and I would put it in a manner where my leader sees not as a complaint, but as me coming up to him or her and saying, hey, look, I am ready for more higher order tasks as well. And why don't you look at me for that? Okay. That's my suggestion on your question. Okay, some questions which are similar, I'm skipping. What is crucial to making the leap to leadership? Okay, look, that's a great question. Now, I sense there's a bit of philosophy attached to it and a bit of pragmatism. My feeling, and I might be a rare commodity in that sense, my feeling is leadership happens first in your head. Are you ready to be a leader? Are you ready to take on the mantle of leadership? That's where the leap into leadership actually starts. If you're ready here in your head, I think that's the first hurdle that has been crossed. The second is self-awareness, asking yourself, what does it take for me to demonstrate leadership capability, whether it's in terms of new skills, new knowledge, new attitudes, and then working on those. And three is putting yourself out there, and saying, look, I'm available, I'm willing to take on responsibility, and I'm happy to learn as well. And the fourth is humility, because no matter who you are bound to falter somewhere or the other. You will miss out on a few things. And the humility to be able to say that, look, I don't know everything. I could go wrong, but you know what? I'm willing to be coached. I'm willing to be mentored. I think those are things which will help the leadership leap. How to handle disagreements with colleagues and teams. While it's not really related to the topic, but I'm glad you asked that. Essentially, what you're talking about is how do I manage conflict? Look, there are 5 styles that you could use in managing conflict. You could use a partnering style, which is actually what results in win-win, conflict management outcomes. Or you could use a challenging style, which is more aggression and a win-lose kind of an approach. You could be obliging or abstaining, which are both conflict avoidant. Or you could use a settling style, also known as a compromising style. At a subtle level, even the settling style is a quasi conflict avoidant kind of a style, because you are not really going all the distance in being assertive or collaborative. I would recommend in that situation to use a partnering style, which is talk about your interests, but also take out time and opportunity to ask people about what their interests could be. Because if you can align your interests and theirs, that is the only sustainable recipe for conflicts to be managed and not come back. Because if that has not been done, you may handle the conflict today, the conflict will come up again tomorrow. So that's my recommendation there, if you would like to take. What is the success mantra for effective leadership? I'm pretty sure if I ask this question, I mean, even to some of the top leaders that I've had the benefit of learning from and respecting, I'm not sure even they can answer this, and certainly I am not the right person to answer this. Success mantras for leadership keep changing and evolving over a period of time. What made me successful 15 years ago, if I continue doing that without changing, may not make me successful today, and certainly not ready me for success tomorrow. So if I were to pick up just 2 things to answer this question, one would be the willingness to keep challenging your assumptions. A lot of times we tend to ignore the paradigms that put us in a cage. if we can identify what paradigms we are laboring under, and if we can then work on those paradigms, show the initiative to work on those paradigms, I think that is one. The other is the willingness to continuously learn. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft Worldwide, one of the things that he does is, even today, with all the time constraints, he still makes it a point to pick up multiple new courses to go through every day, every week. Now, here is a person who has achieved what one would, or most people would say, is the pinnacle of success, but is still spending that much of time and effort on continuously upgrading himself. And I think that is very important, because the moment you stop doing that, you stagnate, and leaders cannot afford to stagnate, right? So those are two things that I would want to say in response to that question. How does empowerment drive high performance? The answer is in that question, because what is empowerment really? When you empower people, you have first satisfied yourself that they are the right people to empower, which means you have a bunch of people who are highly committed, highly competent, independent thinking, can take decisions autonomously, are willing to take ownership and accountability. So, these are people who are already poised for high performance. All you're doing as a leader is just unleashing them out there to the world, right? So your job is not to do anything. Your job is to ensure that you have the people who can be empowered, and then unleash them and get the hell out of the way so that they can do what is needed to be done, which, to your point, is delivering high performance, delivering high results, high innovation. Those are some of the things that one could do. What are the key delegation strategies a leader could implement? Well, we spoke about it during the course of the session. Before you delegate, ask yourself the first question: is this something I should be doing, or is this something that someone else should be doing? If it is something which you are supposed to be doing, well, this doesn't get delegated, obviously. But if this is something which somebody else ought to be doing, sure, you could get them to do it, provided you have validated that they have competence, you validated that they have the commitment, and you are willing to invest time in giving them feedback on what they're doing. You know what happens when you do this to people that you delegate to? Over a period of time, you're able to create individuals whom you can then empower. And that, as we said, is a much more higher value item, right? Okay, Peter, I have a hard stop in 2 minutes.
Yes.
And, so therefore, I just wanted to say it was such a pleasure to be here. The questions were so brilliant, and a lot of thoughts for me also to think about. Some of the stuff like, distributed leadership, connected leadership, I also haven't been thinking about consciously, and therefore there's a lot that I would want to take away. Thank you so much to the viewers for being there, investing your precious time in this session. I only hope that I've been able to add some value to your time.
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you, sir. Thank you so much for sharing your wonderful insights, especially the Schneider culture model, the leadership continuum, and the 5 principles of connected leadership. Very interesting quadrant shared with us. Thank you so much with all those wonderful insights that you have been and that you have brought before us today. It was really amazing, listening to you with all those insights, knowledge that you have shared with us today. So thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you for taking up significant amount of questions. I've seen that you have answered all the questions that are there. So thank you so much for that, sir. So before we conclude with our today's session, we would also want to thank all the association members. So Geisha, NASCOM COE, and LinkedIn Local for supporting these HRAI events. To know more about these associations, request you to kindly visit the link provided in the chat window. Thank you once again, dear speaker, and our participants for joining us today. Do join us for our next masterclass tomorrow on employee engagement by Mr. Vinay Trivedi on the 27th of August 2020. Request you to kindly register for this event at the link mentioned in the chat window. See you soon. Stay safe, take care, and bye for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Shyam, we can now conclude with the webinar.